Today, I'm going to focus on how our findings highlight the applicability of the coercive control framework, originally developed in contexts like intimate partner violence and also sex trafficking. Um, I'll walk us through how coercive control manifests in these settings, some of the core patterns we observed in our data, and what this framework can offer those working with survivors or conducting research in this field. I'll also leave time for questions at the end, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and perspectives. Great. So before we dive in, I want to give you a quick overview where we're headed today. I'll establish groundwork by defining what we mean by cult and walk through the concept of cults. I'll introduce you to the present study, where I'll explain why we believe label and share the research questions that guided our work. So I'll walk you through the methods our participants were and how we collected data. Here we'll see the results of each study question, quantitative participant examples that indicate how coercive control operates. Finally, we'll close with discussion of the broader implications of our findings, limitations, and ideas for future directions. Now, I know most folks in here already know what a cult is. They're familiar with it. But for the sake of operationalizing and understanding where we're coming from in terms of this study, right, we're just going to go through them quickly. And we're definitely going to spend a little more time on coercive control. Some of you may be familiar with the term, but not really familiar with the framework itself. So, level study, here's the definition of cult consistent with the one adopted by ICSA as well as many researchers in the field. Cult is defined as an ideological organization held together by charismatic relationships, demanding total. All three elements need to be present of a system or ideology, compelling leadership, and a demand of information, often overruns personal autonomy or outside conditions. That said, right, not all intense or belief-based communities, healthy religious or spiritual groups share some surface features. They don't isolate members or retaliate when people short walk away without fear of punishment. As we all know, while sensationalized cults are pervasive and typically without legal compulsion, these groups entrap members and maintain commitment using imbalances, systematically breaking down autonomy, causing long-lasting adverse. Members become so entrenched in their faulty use of all to leave, and when you actually do, able to identify their own qualities for beings. A lot of other studies find high prevalence of PTSD, right, and severe difficulty in activities such as decision making, understanding gender roles, establishing and maintaining new relationships, keeping employment, and having a sense of identity. So those are just some of many things that people struggle with when they leave, which again, I'm speaking to the choir right now, but right. So moving on. What is coercive control? Simply stated, coercive control is a strategic and ongoing implementation of abuse tactics designed to limit a victim's decision-making ability by denying them of liberty, autonomy, and equality. Lots of big words there, but the objective of the coercer is to create dependency, foster compliance, and solidify their victim's unwavering commitment. This definition gives us a foundation, but to apply coercive control meaningfully, we must move from concept to operational clarity. Right. The slide's a little bit busy, but there's a lot of animations, so make it a little easier to look at. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at how coercive control sharpens from a broad conceptual model to an organizing framework with defining features and to the operational definition that guided our analysis. At the top, we begin with the broadest understanding of coercive control as a human rights violation and a form of systemic power abuse that leads to a chronic imbalance. This framing draws from Evan Stark's original work and has been extended by Dr. Raghavan and many other researchers to apply outside of romantic partnerships. From there, we identified three core features that organize coercive control as a framework. First, it is continuous, pervasive, By continuous meaning, we mean it's not incident-based, right? It's an ongoing thing. It is pervasive, impacting multiple aspects of the victim's world. And it weaponizes privileged information, using what the perpetrator knows about the victim to tailor and intensify their control. Finally, at the operational level, we use 8 specific tactics to identify and code coercive control in participant narratives. We will discuss these in depth shortly, but here we see surveillance, microregulation, degradation, intimidation, deprivation, isolation, sexual coercion and abuse, and finally, manipulation and exploitation. By clearly defining and naming these tactics up front, our goal was to ensure a shared language for identifying coercive control, both in research and in practice. This allowed us to assess how coercive control was enacted, not just generally, but specifically, strategically, and systematically. So let's go over those tactics. As I mentioned, there are 8, right? First, there are the larger, more pronounced tactics, such as intimidation, degradation, deprivation, and surveillance. Typical behaviors include threats, verbal abuse, denying food, and stalking, respectively, although there's many others, I assure you. Then there are the more subtle tactics, the invisible ones that are difficult to detect, like microregulation, manipulation, and isolation. A cult leader may microregulate their followers by dictating what they can and cannot wear, manipulate by professing they're the voice of God, and isolate members from their family or their friends. The final tactic is that of sexual coercion and abuse, which occurs most privately of all tactics. Now we've clarified our key terms. Let's turn to the study at hand, examining the unique advantages of this framework, what it offers, and the specific questions that guided our analysis. So that's busy, I'm sorry. I will walk you through it. We know cults are powerful systems, but what is still unclear is how exactly they manage to keep people trapped. Research tends to focus on the who, the charismatic leader, or the what, the high-profile forms of abuse that make headlines. But what we don't talk about enough is the glue, the invisible mechanisms that keep people in place long after immediate threat has gone. We hear survivors say, "I couldn't get out," and the general public ask, why? Why not? That's the gap we're trying to fill. Cult research still lacks, unfortunately, a shared research-backed language, often conflates abusive tactics with psychological outcomes of those tactics, and it doesn't offer a model flexible enough to account for power in systems with a single leader, multiple abusers, or fear-driven coercion. And while we've defined what control is, it's just as important to define what it's not. Right? It is not a single traumatic event. It's not always loud. It doesn't require bruises or threats. And that's what makes it so powerful, because it's easy to overlook, right? The real danger is that coercive control can look like choice, like loyalty, like devotion, but underneath it's a system carefully designed to erode autonomy over time. And if we want to understand how people remain entrapped, even in the absence of overt violence, we need a framework that can detect that kind of ongoing relational abuse and measure it. So with that in mind, let's turn to what we've gathered from coercive control research in other domains, particularly domestic violence and sex trafficking, and why it offers such a compelling lens to study cultic abuse. Coercive control research has already taught us plenty about how systems of power and entrapment operate over time. First, this framework is adept at detecting the electrical current of abuse. It helps us understand that abuse isn't always a constant high. There's spikes and there's lulls. Some days might look calm or even caring, but the current is always running underneath. That's what makes it so difficult to recognize. Lost my place. Makes it so difficult to recognize from people from the outside and even sometimes within, right? Second, coercive control has proven incredibly useful in explaining why people get trapped. In sex trafficking and domestic violence, we now understand that people don't stay because they're weak, brainwashed, or complicit. They stay because they're systematically broken down, isolated, and controlled. Third, and perhaps most importantly, coercive control is increasingly enshrined in law. In the UK, coercive control is a standalone offense under domestic abuse laws. The US, California, and Connecticut have passed statutes criminalizing coercive control tactics, and the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act explicitly addresses psychological and emotional abuse as part of human trafficking. That kind of legal validation does more than protect survivors. It gives researchers a clear, testable framework to operationalize and measure nonviolent abuse. That's why applying this framework to cultic environments where the same dynamics play out holds such promise. It's already battle tested in the courts and proven in the field. So, to recap, in case you didn't hear at the beginning, while cults have widely been recognized as coercive, the terminology used to describe these environments and the level of abuse has not been measured as systematically as it could be. Further, previous research has examined the outcomes of abuse, but often conflated those outcomes with the tactics used. Our research sought to address this dearth by expanding the coercive control framework to cults, recognizing coercive dynamics in cults bear similarity to those found in other contexts. All right. The present study focused on the following 3 questions. If you can't see it in the back, I will read them to you. First, who utilized coercive control? Was the primary coercer a group leader, or was coercion perpetrated by the group as a collective? Second, which tactics were most commonly identified by participants? And lastly, which specific behaviors were identified within each coercive control tactic and were unique to the cult context? All right, so let's talk first about who our participants were. We interviewed 121 adults who had spent about a year or more in high control group and left within the last 15 years. Because of stigma and safety concerns, of course, we couldn't randomly sample or name specific groups. Participants were recruited through broadcast emails to support networks such as ICSA and snowball referrals. We used a semi-structured interview guide consisting of 5 different sections that walk participants through their experience from start to finish. However, I'm only reporting today on the section that's relevant to the present study. Interviews were conducted via telephone, WhatsApp, for approximately an hour and a half to 3 hours, depending on how much people had to say, and anonymized to protect confidentiality. We applied an existing codebook to identify each coercive control tactic, and our interrater reliability was excellent, 82.6% to 98.4% agreement, indicating the measure is reliable. Feel free to ask me more questions about the methods towards the Q&A, but I'm going to continue. All right, so in terms of demographics, our sample was remarkably diverse, both demographically and geographically. Participants ranged from 18 to 68 years old, and while over 63% of the fathers nearly 7% was identified as transgender. About 29% of participants were international, although over 77% identified as white. The remaining participants included Black, Latinx, mixed race, and Asian individuals, which is more diversity than you typically find in cult research. And then finally, the average length of involvement was 21 years, underscoring many participants' experienced also the membership of word. All right, so a standout feature of our sample is that over 60% had attended college, well above the national average, highlighting that higher education doesn't immunize against existential vulnerability. We categorized participants' former groups. A clear majority came from neo-Christian movements, but we also saw an important shift. A sizable minority now affiliate with emerging groups from psychological self-help to other world phenomena, indicating a turn away from Christian frameworks. These patterns illustrated how deeply the search for meaning and fear of death cut across ideological lines. So, now let's take their findings. First and foremost, the first question asks, who utilized coercive control in the sample? Just over half of the sample pointed to the entire group as their primary coercer, echoing dynamics in trafficking where peers enforce control. About 1/3 named a single individual, similar to patterns of intimate partner violence, aka IPV. And roughly 10% identified a pair or a small team, in the leader's spouse or a co-founder, working together to maintain control. These patterns highlight the need for a framework that captures both group level coercion and targeted abuse. Take one for the end, please, Kulim. I'm easily distracted today, unfortunately. Okay, question 2. Having mapped out who wielded coercive control, we now turn to how that power was applied, specifically which tactics were most commonly used. But before we dive into individual tactics, let's first examine the number of tactics each participant experienced just to gauge how multifaceted and abusive these environments were. Remember, I said there were 8 tactics, right? Well, yeah. What stands out immediately is that all 121 participants reported experiencing coercive control. No one described fewer than 3 tactics. However, even more striking is that nearly 70% of the sample, specifically 83 individuals out of 121, endorse experiencing 7 or all 8 tactics, underscoring that these environments are intensely coercive, employing multiple tactics at once. Right. So the vast majority had somewhere between like 5 or 6 and 7 and 8. All right. So moving on. What this table makes clear is that coercive control in cults is all encompassing. Manipulation, intimidation, and microregulation are virtually unanimous, experienced by nearly every participant. So isolation, surveillance, deprivation, and degradation, respectively, were present at high rates, specifically between 85 to 91%. All tactics were highly prevalent except for sexual coercion and abuse, and nearly 25%, which is relatively high but much lower compared to the other tactics. Beyond this breakdown is not remarkable. So what we did to kind of get a clearer understanding of what was going on frequently is we broke down the data in a more nuanced way. I see a little bit of the pattern shift. Walk you through it. Here we shifted from presence to frequency. Specifically, participants that said they experienced the tactic frequently, which is the highest frequency that we provided. What emerges is a clear reordering. Manipulation and microregulation emerge as occurring frequently for roughly 81% of participants. Intimidation follows at slightly over 71% and isolation at nearly 64%. Interestingly, surveillance, which was almost unanimous for everyone, was only really frequently happening for about half of the sample. And then on the other hand, degradation and deprivation dropped to under 30 and 22% respectively. And sexual coercion fell to just 5%. So this pattern shows that the more invisible tactics are not only widespread, but also the most consistently applied, whereas more overt and violent tactics occur less frequently. There's my animation. Okay, so our final study question sought to identify tactic behaviors in the cult context. Specifically, what specific things were going on, right? We have these broad tactic names. We don't know exactly what those behaviors are. So this slide indicates subtactics that overlapped with IPV, so partner violence, and sex trafficking. Right. So the ones highlighted in green had kind of a different flavor, even though they overlapped. And I'm going to explain what I mean in just a minute. Manipulation, for example, included classic gaslighting, but was frequently doctrinal. Right? They justified hypocrisy in sacred texts, dismissed contradictory beliefs, even redefined or minimized sexual assault to protect the group's image. That's not things that you see like that in other contexts. Economic exploitation of both time and money also looked familiar, but here members were forced into endless service, expensive trainings, literature purchases they couldn't afford, rather than having their passports withheld or money controlled as seen in other contexts. Intimidation subtactics of punishment and threat similarly differed. Punishment was odd in these groups and rarely physical. Instead, members might have been forced into isolation or publicly shamed, while punishment in other contexts is often seen in the form of strict privileges or physical abuse. Much like gaslighting, threats centered around spirituality and hinged on salvation or status. losing your place in heaven, your rank in the group, or facing social and legal repercussions. And though verbal abuse is common across many abusive contexts, the verbal abuse in these groups was very interesting because many groups invent their own derogatory lexicon and insider insults. So we would see terms like suppressive person, words that only sting group members, not people outside of the dynamic. Interestingly, isolation and deprivation remain chillingly similar across contexts. Abusers isolated their victims on the premise that everyone within the dynamic is good, all naysayers are bad, and food, sleep, and medical care can be withheld. So what you see right now is just some of the tactics. Here's all of the tactics, which, there you go. We're going to talk about the ones in blue on the next slide, so you won't get confused with how many warlords are on this page. But let's talk about these real quick. Microregulation was brought in this context, as rules and cults are meant to suffocate. Groups engage in daily policing of mainstream materials like books and music, activities like going to the movies or celebrating holidays, diet, and even sexual expression. In fact, sexual expression was overbearingly monitored. Cult leaders often preached abstinence and tried at even the most innocent displays of affection, or conversely, pushed for sexual promiscuity. Further, masturbation, dating, and kissing were often enforced by doctrine. Intimidation behavior centered around displaced abuse, witnessing displaced aggression such as fist slams, or the punishment of others kept members in mind. Isolation extended into gender segregation, often under the guise of purity. And surveillance went beyond check-ins. Some groups kept detailed files on attendance, donations, personal anecdotes, even home addresses. Degradation include demotion, forced manual labor, public humiliation, like confessing alleged sins in front of the group. Deprivation reached into mental health and growth. Members were denied psychiatric care, education, and subjected to shunning. Shunning specifically was used as a means of psychological torture to force submission or as a lure for members who left to return. These cult-specific subtactics were not only unique, they were also collectively enforced by multiple actors, amplifying their reach and making escape that much harder. And this was especially salient for SGAs and members whose entire families were within the groups for many generations, right? It's very difficult to leave every single person you know and go on and do your own thing. So, all right. I'd like to present one example of how coercive control operated predominantly through group-level coercion, group-level surveillance. Our participant is a gay Latinx male in his mid-30s who joined the group during a period of intense vulnerability, navigating depression, estrangement from family, and financial instability. He is quickly elevated within the group, receiving attention and privileges that reinforced his value, while simultaneously being under constant watch, with handlers assigned to accompany him everywhere. Surveillance was paired with threats, with personal disclosures recorded and used to intimidate him. As he explained to me, one of the things they said is that they'll use anything in your folder against you. I put extreme lies because it's unpredictable and malevolent. I didn't know what they would do. Throughout his time in the group, he was continually pushed to reframe his thoughts and experiences, often emerging from meetings in a dissociative or confused state. Over time, the group restricted what he could eat, who he could date, and how he expressed his sexual identity. Verbal abuse was directed at his sexuality, while those who questioned the group, such as his partner, were considered suppressive and cut off. Compliance was met with affirmation and continued status. Non-compliance risked spiritual punishment, social disconnection, and retaliation. Although participant 33 held a special position in the group, his autonomy was slowly eroded through layered control, manipulation, and fear. Let's contrast this account with another participant whose experience highlighted how coercive control can take a more emotionally and sexually exploitative form. Participant 13 is a white bisexual female in her late 30s who joined a psychological self-help group after a traumatic breakup. At the time, she felt profound loneliness and search for immediate connection. What drew her initially to the group was their promise of healing, purpose, and belonging. But what followed was a sustained campaign of manipulation and control. Unlike the previous example where surveillance played a dominant role, this participant's experience was marked by emotional, financial, and sexual abuse. She described being subject to relentless pressure to perform, spending tens of thousands of dollars on courses while earning little money within the organization, and being verbally abused or punished when she questioned the root norms. Although she rose in rank and received attention from leadership, her daily life was tightly controlled. Her dress, her schedule, and even romantic partners were dictated. She was forced to conform to highly scripted sexual roles and gaslit regularly. Her perception was invalidated by leaders who used convoluted group jargon to obscure harm. The threat of failure, of being asleep or incapable of growth, was used to keep her compliant. Her group identity replaced outside connections. Those not in the group were considered lesser, disconnected, and asleep. Meanwhile, her emotional needs were met with manipulation through cycles of love bombing, withdrawal, and intimidation. Despite emotional deprivation, sex monitoring was frequent. She experienced multiple instances of sexual coercion by leadership and was pressured into unwanted sexual practices under the guise of spiritual awakening. When participant 13 pushed back, she was told, "You're not going to be free, not going to get the growth, always going to be afraid." Though her role appeared empowering from the outside, she was gradually broken down by a system that framed submission as spiritual growth and relied on fear, shame, and strategic deprivation to keep her loyal. This is my final participant I'll discuss. Our final participant highlights how coercive control can be woven into the fabric of the community and their daily ritual. While the participant endured an environment shaped by while the previous participant endured an environment shaped by a charismatic. Participant 5, a white trans woman in her 20s, was recruited into a communal Eastern religious group as a homeless teenager seeking spiritual meaning and belonging. The group provided what she initially perceived as stability and purpose. But once inside, the control was overwhelming. She lived in a temple with strict schedules, watchful eyes, minimal rest, and severe lifestyle restrictions. Her gender identity was erased through spiritual rhetoric that demanded rigid gender roles, celibacy, and self-denial. She was publicly shamed for asking questions or expressing dissent, often humiliated during worship service. When her behavior did not meet expectations, she was assigned grueling manual labor as punishment. Participant 5 also faced subtle and overt intimidation, warned that leaving the temple would result in moral decay and ruin. Over time, she began to believe these messages, saying, "I really looked down on myself for a large portion of time I lived in the temple, especially about my gender identity. They'd say it was a reflection of my moral character, and it was something I greatly internalized." Although no single tactic appeared dominant here, the cumulative effects of these 7 tactics created an environment where submission felt like the only path to worthiness and redemption. All right, so giving you a lot of information, but what does it all mean and where do we go from here? All right, let's discuss. So, this study demonstrates that coercive control in cults is not simply top-down. More than half of participants describe the group itself, fellow members, as key enforcers of abuse, echoing dynamics seen in trafficking. Well, the key takeaway, as you already seen and gasped at, right, is that cults are highly coercive. Manipulation of microregulation are the foundational ones, barraging members with daily activities carried out in minute ways, and meeting opposition with gaslighting and deception. Abusers threaten members with loss of enlightenment, isolate them from outside influence, becoming members' only source of comfort and to prevent them from leaving. That's seen in other contexts, I assure you. Another takeaway was that tactics manifest differently depending on context. They're still there, but the behaviors are slightly different. And what's important to think about when we talk about these differences in behavior is that they're often justified by spiritual doctrine. This legitimization empowered both leaders and members to enforce control without guilt or consequence. And lastly, the takeaway is that the coercive control framework not only captured this dynamic, it organized it. That tells us it's not only a useful tool, it's a necessary one. So naturally, the study, like any study, had limitations. Because data collection began shortly before the pandemic, much to my ire, we primarily reached people with internet access. Also, participants varied in how recently they left their groups. Some were freshly out, others had spent years rebuilding and working hard to change their perspective. Thus, recall may have been affected. Still, the patterns were pretty striking. While physical and sexual violence were less common than anticipated, subtle, sustained tactics like microregulation and manipulation were everywhere. It's worth noting that these findings may have been shaped by who felt safe enough to disclose, right? So some of the people who experienced more severe trauma or not did not want to relive that experience with me over the phone, right? Understandable. Nonetheless, these findings remind us to think about harm in cults and less about bruises and more about people. As we close, so I got us there on time, I think, right? Okay. As we close, I want to highlight a few key directions moving forward. First, these results should be replicated and expanded. Despite limitations, the framework proved comprehensive. It allowed participants to describe not just what happened to them, but how it happened in nuanced and personal, deeply personal terms. Those who endured the most extreme forms of abuse may not have felt safe or ready, of course, but we were still able to capture a lot of what was going on, the trauma that they experienced. So all of this to say, it really reinforces the need for trauma-informed, survivor-centered research. Second, the findings offer critical implications for both clinical and legal settings. Cults rarely operate under a single abuser. Power is often decentralized, with members themselves acting as enforcers. The framework helps identify those dynamics, helping us hold the right people accountable, especially as coercive control gains recognition in the law. It also gives clinicians and advocates shared language to decode tactics that are often invisible but devastating in impact. Wrapping up, this is the first study of its kind to systematically apply the coercive control framework and measure abuse, and it worked. The framework captured broad tactics, specific behaviors, and their intensity, giving us a clear picture of the relational power dynamics shaping life within and between groups. It distinguishes cultic abuse from other contexts and illuminates how doctrine justifies and perpetuates harm. Perhaps the most important takeaway that's not as much scientific but matters to me is that participants felt seen. Many describe the interview process as clarifying, validating, and even cathartic. That's the power of having language to your experience. And that's why this work matters. So to truly understand cults and to support survivors, we must continue to study coercive control, not just as an abstract theory, but as a lived experience. Promising next step is exploring how coercion evolves into indoctrination and how belief itself becomes a binding force. I want to quickly thank you all for staying and dealing with the door creaks for me, but also to my participants who bravely shared their stories with me and mentor my research assistants, our lab, for their unwavering support. I'm grateful to be part of this work and even more excited to see where it leads. These findings are sobering, but also hopeful, because once we can map abuse, we can name it. And once we can name it, we can begin to dismantle it. That's all I have for you. Thank you.